Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Canal Forest Restoration Program. We're glad actually you're with us. Here is a team. We have Kristen Haines, and we have George and Jane Polk, and we have the two interns, Delaney and Piper. I would like briefly to introduce myself, and then everybody else will introduce themselves. And then actually I will introduce George. I have few things to say about the origin of the program at the field station. So that is after the introduction. I am the current director of the field station. My specialty is in plant systematics and plant ecology. Specifically, I studied the biology and the systematics of parasitic plants. And I did some research on the ecological niche modeling of parasitic and invasive plants as they are affected by climate change. And because of my background for the master degree and the BS degree, I do have interest in ethnobotany, which is the use of plants by human, and I do teach in that area too. Kristen?
I'm Kristen Haines. I'm the Assistant Director of Rice Creek Field Station. And my background is in plant conservation biology and ecology. I actually did not work on trees. I worked on alpine plants, but I found that a lot of sort of the techniques that I worked on in graduate school have translated pretty well into this project. So that's my background. I guess on to George, if you want to introduce yourself, George and Jane.
Okay, I'm George Polk, and this is Jane, my wife. We've been married 60 years now, and we work on all this project together, and we live in Arizona during the winter, and in our summers we spend it usually up in upstate New York on the Erie Canal mostly. And I'll explain some of that. But what I want to do is tell you how a retired physician, that's me, got involved with trees. I was a biology major in college, but I went to medical school and then became very much oriented to just seeing people, and concentrated on learning and all the intricacies of individual people. Well, gradually, I moved around as we moved to different parts of the country, and we've been boaters and explorers and so forth. But we lived in Maine for quite a few years, and we began to be interested in trees. And what a really interesting thing happened to me was what I think can happen to anybody. And that is I began to see trees. And that means something to me, especially because what now, since about 40 years ago, I suddenly started to see trees in a different way. And rather than I could see individual trees and see how they were growing and what was characteristic of each tree. And Wendy earlier mentioned about driving a car and looking at trees. Well, sometimes that happens to me. I actually see trees as I drive a car and get a little bit distracted. But there are so many characteristics of individual trees, the way they grow, the way the leaves are shaped on one side of the tree or the other, the bark, the roots, and the crowding of trees or the different ways they grow. And what we gradually did was become interested in mostly the nut trees or the hardwoods, because they were so rare in a sense in the forests of the United States in general, really, which have been cut many times, and there are very few areas of real native forest anymore. So we kind of worked on projects that would develop collecting the tree seeds and working with people to teach them how to do that and how to prepare the seeds, get them ready so that they would be able to be planted, and giving them away, and doing that all over Maine and some of New Hampshire. So we had a lot of fun with that, and very successful educational project for school kids and so forth. But we were, as I said, also boaters. And when I retired from the Indian Health Service here in Arizona, we got a boat that we could spend the whole summer on, and just the two of us, and had enough space to do that. So we have ended up being pretty conveniently located on the Erie Canal mostly, where it's easy sailing when you're in your 80s. And so we have sort of studied the trees there and developed this forest restoration project and relating it to the canals, because boaters know there are certain woods that are historically and practically related to boating and boat building. The white pines were coveted by the European monarchs as masts for their boats, their ships, and for their fleets. And there were also, yeah, that's good. You can show the slides there. That's, and they were very depleted by the people coming and taking the trees. And the oak trees, particularly the white oak and the swamp white oak, are known for its water resistant nature. And so it has historically, for hundreds of years, been used for the hulls and supports structure of ships and barges. Well, these are some of the trees that we became interested in the forests of upstate New York. The next slide shows the variations and looking at trees from season to season, oaks and other trees. And what happened was that these trees were systematically used to make the structure of the ships and boats and canal structure, even the locks and pilings. And go on with the slides. This shows how the real one of the older trees at one time, a couple hundred years ago, and I think maybe Piper or Delaney are going to talk more about this. There were the forest of this area was probably characterized by having huge, beautiful, stately white oak and other oak trees and white pine groves, and they're gone. And so we were thinking of this, developing a project to restore, next slide, these trees to the forest of this very large area with natural native trees, and changing the attitude of people toward these trees and allowing them to be restored and grow and become the wonderful trees that they were hundreds of years ago. The next slide shows the white oak, and it has these special characteristics, as I mentioned, about what being a water-resistant wood. And it makes it ideal for the hulls of barges and ships. And so it was used a lot. Next slide. Oh, and the acorns of the white oak and other oaks are edible. So not only for the wildlife, which depends a lot on that food to fatten up in the fall, but for people, we should have a webinar sometime about the use of acorn food, because historically, I think archaeologists are beginning to realize that it was a very important food, probably for tens of thousands of years for humans all around the earth. And there are oaks all around the earth of different varieties. And the acorns are very good nutrition if they're prepared right. And there's some story to how to do that. We should be telling, I think. Anyway, next slide shows the white pine and its seed cone. And there are, of course, the good air qualities and huge trees that can grow to be hundreds of years old and beautiful. Next slide. This shows the pilings in the water that probably, in my opinion, at least I have this idea that the small white oaks were used for pilings, and it didn't even allow them to grow to a age of being able to produce acorns. And thus they and still are used for the water's resistant or longevity of pilings in docks and places all up and down everywhere, the Erie Canal, the Hudson, all the thousands of canals that dotted, that were all over the eastern United States. As you know, the canal is very important, was very important to the development of the United States. And the Erie Canal became the link between the East Coast and the Midwest. And the huge trade that went up and down or back and forth across the United States depended on the canals for a long time. And one of the big things that facilitated the trade was the barrels. It was the sort of the packaging equipment of the day. And the barrel is usually made of white oak. And so it was another reason why the great white oak trees were used so much and virtually disappeared from anywhere near the canal and the waterfronts. Next slide. As you know, the barrel is still very important in characterizing certain wines and spirits and so forth. And okay, so one day we came upon this barge, and Jane and I were in our small boat, and we came and tied up next to the Lois McClure, which is the 110-foot barge that it's a recreation of two barges that were sailing barges that were found under Lake Champlain. And the archaeologists for the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum studied them, measured and restored and built this barge, which is made of white oak and white pine. And it we came to the Oswego Canal, just south, a few miles from the Rice Creek Center, and tied up there and talked to the crew and Captain Eric and the archaeologists, and got them interested in furthering the restoration of the white oaks. So next slide. Some other views of the Lois McClure and its pusher tug, and going through the Erie Canal. Next slide. And we had a lot of good time growing some trees and making an arrangement with the New York State nursery with David Lee, the director, to supply us with more trees. And then we got trees and gave them to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And the next slide, they began using them as teaching students and in schools. And then in the summer of 2017, next slide, we put them aboard as the cargo of the Lois McClure. And the Lois McClure made a trip all the way from Lake Champlain to Buffalo, and the lakes and rivers and canals, and stopping in villages and towns and cities and giving away some trees. So we were talking with lots of city and town people, officials, and giving them a few white oak and white pine trees. And we received a wonderful support of people, liking the idea of restoring these trees to the huge area around the canals of upstate New York and Vermont. Next slide. That's my granddaughter. She helped grow them and been one of the many volunteers, that's Zora and Jane, and aboard the Lois McClure. Next slide. So, and that deck you see they're walking on is white pine. It's about 2 inches thick, and it was a lighter wood, so it was a superstructure of the barge. There were thousands of these barges going back and forth. There's some of our white oak trees, and people coming through. Thousands of people came aboard that summer. And we're all that we were talked to were fascinated by the idea of restoring the trees to the native forest of upstate New York. Next slide. There's the captain and some of the crew and city town people. I think that's the knitting mill and they're the women's center in Seneca Falls, and some of our trees. Next slide. The following year, we couldn't, the Lois McClure was doing different projects, so we did developed our own growing trees in a nursery, and gave away many trees at town festivals and so forth, and had a really good time giving some talks and so forth. And unfortunately, there's so much, thousands of square miles to cover, where the oak trees and the white pine trees are missing, and still. But people are interested in doing that. So when we had to move our trees out of that nursery, we finally contacted Professor Muhammad and the Oswego SUNY, and they have taken on the project, which is wonderful. And as you can see, we have the interns now, and we're growing, we're collecting seeds and growing them. And so I think they'll tell you more about that. And I think those are the main things that I can cover. Do you have any points that I'm missing, Kristen, or anyone? There's Kamal.
Yeah. My screen. Kamal, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I guess so. I just want to tell how I got to know George. He actually called me. I was sitting in my office during my office hours. And actually, I think that is luckily enough, because usually I do not answer the phones. But since it is the office hour, I thought, okay, it could be student. And then actually on the other side was George. And he was telling me about his ideas, the fact that he was a retired physician, but the love of trees is obvious. And he was talking to me like I am a botanist about vernalization and all those kind of neat things. And I thought at the time, maybe this is George. I mean, just by mistake became a physician instead of a botanist. He could be, or she could have been a botanist. But anyway, actually, when he mentioned it at the time, also, I was talking to a colleague about what should we do about actually the fact that the ashes or the ash trees are gonna disappear soon because we knew or we know the emerald ash borer is at our doorsteps. And so we were thinking about, okay, what can we do to replace the ashes? And we were thinking and actually examining some of the trees, which could be mid to late successional species. And then I believe actually, when I talked to George, the white oaks and the white pine could do that. And so I was really enthusiastic about the program as he is. And of course, you heard him, his love and passion for trees, and to the extent that actually he involved his family and his son and his grandkids. He just mentioned Zohra a minute ago. So I think actually it's a good thing, and it's a noble purpose. And we are dedicated actually to this. I mean, the Canal Forest team, including Kristen and the interns, and those who will come in the future. And we will continue doing our best to educate people about the importance of trees, and we will continue providing and growing trees.
Right.
Thanks, Kamal, and thanks, George. So just to share with folks a little more formally, I guess, kind of a few of our project goals, because Delaney and Piper will be touching on this a little bit. So basically, a primary goal is to replenish the whole canal region with enough of these particular trees that they can have an ecological significance on the landscape, and also be there for cultural significance, so that people almost have that cultural memory again of having, especially, species like white oak that we don't really find very often in our forests anymore. We hope to, I think, Kamal alluded to this, we hope to foster awareness of these issues, of the importance of trees in general, but the importance of these trees, and kind of the role they played, and their legacy, and the importance of bringing them back to be on our landscape. We are, as was stated, kind of collecting trees and producing seeds, and this is all for free distribution to the public to reintroduce these trees to the area, and we're seeking collaborations with a number of people. And kind of finally, a final goal, a lot of the project was founded on this like historical premise, but we're also sort of looking to the future and planning to plant these very long-lived species that can store carbon and help mitigate the effects of climate change so that it kind of ensures a better future for our region, but also the planet in our own, small way. So I guess having said that, you'll be hearing from Delaney a little bit more about the history of these trees and their historical ecology of them. And after that, Piper will be talking a little bit more about that kind of sustainability aspect. So I just want to introduce Delaney first. So Delaney is an intern with our project. She started in January of this year. She's a junior at SUNY Oswego studying zoology. Delaney grew up in Massachusetts and has always had a strong interest in the natural world, and especially things like preserving endangered species of all kinds. So she hopes that this project will inspire others to participate and protect the natural world. For our project, Delaney has focused on social media development and also conducting this historical ecology research about our particular focal species. And you'll be hearing from her right now about that.
Thanks, Kristen. That was awesome. Yeah, so a big part of what I do for the project is the ecological research. So I look back at the history of different species. And when Kristen came to me with this, it was kind of one of those, like, I like history, I like research, so this should be interesting, but starting was very difficult. Like, where do you start? Because to understand the future, you have to understand the past, but what part of the past did I really want to know? So for me, I kind of looked at 4 major time periods in North America. So I looked at pre-colonial, colonial, industrial, and the modern times. Each of them had really interesting reasons for me to pick them. So like pre-colonial, with the indigenous people of the region, a lot of their history and their culture is oral. So they orally teach their children. There's no written documentation that really explains, what was going on, why they chose certain things, how they handled certain things. It's all in their oral history that they taught each other. So for me, I felt going before that time period was going to be extremely difficult, and I didn't really know how to go about that. So I kind of considered right mid 1600s to early 1700s for pre-colonial era to really kind of understand what was going on right before the colonialization boom of the late 1600s to mid 1700s. And in that time period, there were more written documentations in North America because you had Europeans coming over, and in their culture, they wrote down everything. So it was much easier to kind of understand what was going on then, because you have just before the boom, a few colonies were forming, and within a couple decades, you had hundreds of people coming over from different cultures, different areas, just trying to survive. And then from mid 1700s to about early 1800s is that colonial era I kind of consider. And then I go into the industrial era, which is when major industrial booms were happening, mills, manufacturing were really taking a hold and really changing the landscape even more. Mills were built on streams, on canals, because there was no electricity originally. So they used the water power to sustain themselves, to keep them going. Once electricity kind of came into play, they kind of didn't need that area anymore. So they just kind of abandoned it. and they left these structures, left these buildings, and moved to more urban areas to create meccas for farmers from rural areas to come to and use the skills that they were doing at the farm with making their own clothing, tending to cattle in an urban setting where they would be paid a little bit more and have more of a stable income. So that's kind of the industrial era. I consider early mid 1800s to the 1900s, kind of 1920s-ish is kind of that era I look at. And then modern, I consider 1950s with the heightened nuclear testing, globalization really taking effect after the World War I and World War II, to 2020, to right now with my research. So having those time periods, I then kind of was like, okay, so let's look at each tree species and kind of work from there. But that got kind of difficult because a lot of it overlapped. The histories were really intertwined, along with their uses were intertwined. So it kind of was easier to group white oak with swamp white oak because, especially in pre-colonial, colonial times, you had surveyors coming, not only from the colonies, but from England and Spain to kind of evaluate what was going on. And these were not formal botanists. They didn't necessarily have training. They just may have been picked like, you grow crops. Maybe you should do this, So there was never really a formal training there to really identify certain species. So when you look at a tree, you may be looking at, a maple and a pine, and they look different, so they're different. But if you look at a white oak versus a swamp white oak, it's subtle differences that are there that you may not catch if you're not looking for it. So oak trees got kind of weird in the history because they were just considered oak. There was no real white oaks are this amount, swamp white oaks are this amount. There was none of that. So I kind of had to generalize the history a little bit. But it still is the same no matter what species of oak you're really talking about. They all face the same challenges. So I looked at originally the uses for each tree. So for, like George was talking about, white oak and swamp white oak, they were continuously used for cabinetry, furniture, interior trims, flooring, boat building, and barrels. So knowing what they were used for, I had to understand why they were chosen. And for white oak and swamp white oak, their wood is rot resistant. It's some of the best wood you can get for a low price, and you don't have to replace it as often. Even if you take it out on the canals, even if you take it out on the ocean, it's so durable that you don't have to replace it as often as a different type of wood. Plus, it was economical. There was so much of it in the New World that they were able to access it a lot, especially monarchs in Europe, which I will talk about a little bit more a little later for the white pine, because a lot of major events in the American Revolution took place because of a riot for white pine. So it was very difficult finding a lot of pre-colonial colonial information because it was all kind of blurred together. They were looking at just trees in general. They weren't necessarily looking at specific species of trees. So one of the articles I found that was really helpful in breaking everything down was called 4 Centuries of Change in Northeastern U.S. Forests. It's from 2013 by Jonathan R. Thompson. In it, what they did was they took colonial surveying maps, overlaid them with modern maps, and looked for colonial towns that still existed today, and estimated based on what the markings were on the surveyor's map, how many trees are left over. What was really interesting, though, is these surveyors back in the late early 1700s were so detailed, they tried their best to specify what types of trees were on somebody's property. So from these maps, they looked at 9 Northeast states, all the way from Maine to Pennsylvania, everything in between there, and New Jersey. Connecticut was kind of interesting, though, because in Connecticut, the surveyors actually were trained And they had a colonial forest inventory from the 1700s with samples of trees on various different types of property. So Connecticut was kind of a weird one because Connecticut was super detailed. A lot of these other states, though, were not. These were not trained surveyors. They were not trained botanists. They were just like, this tree kind of looks like that tree, so they must be the same. So their study, in part, did a lot of different types of trees. For oaks specifically, though, they looked at 489 colonial towns. Of these towns, in their maps, they had about 50,000 oak trees mapped out. In the present, there still exists, the existence of those colonial towns was only at 467, and the total oak trees was 11,662. That's about a 76% loss in less than 400 years, which is insane. And from there, you know, you got to look at, okay, what were the causes? Like before, boat building, barrels, cabinetries. But they also listed squirrels as being a major cause of it because squirrels will start biting into the acorns and then forget about it. They'll leave them somewhere and just totally forget. But the acorn may not be viable based on how they ate it. So not only were humans a huge cause of it, but squirrels had some major impact, but not as big as humans. So that's kind of where I've gotten to with that. Colonial wise, that was kind of the biggest source of information I could gather. And then I went into the Industrial Revolution, that era. And a lot of the same reasons, there were still boats. You still had cabinetry. Houses were bigger, because people were at home. They had settled. These are generations of people who had lived here by this point. They weren't leaving necessarily. So they built houses. They built the space that they felt they needed or could afford to get. Along with this, you have meccas being formed from mills and people traveling to these mills to work, to live. So you need space. So you need to clear the space for that. So that not only meant agricultural fields were demolished and built over, forests were demolished and built over. A lot of those are the same causes we have today. Building cities, more space for people. So looking at the current climate of white oak and swamp white oak, the consensus is the population is rapidly declining still. And that there's a lack of regeneration in white oak due to a whole abundance of reasons. The biggest three that they talked about were fire exclusion, insect defoliators, so ripping off the leaves of trees and the acorns and just demolishing the foliage of the trees, which also helps support the tree life, along with climate change. Climate change was considered the #1 cause of everything that has happened to this population. So going from there, I moved on to white pine, kept going. So to understand white pine, I also looked at what was the world like for animals that live in it. Why is it so important to nature? And white pine's really cool because it has a lot of reasons. The ones I've listed out were that birds, squirrels, and chipmunks will specifically find white pine trees and eat only their seeds and acorns. They will not go, if they are able to find a white pine, they will return to that tree continuously and avoid other trees that are not white pine. Birds, they build nests in the trees. And for bald eagles in the Northeast, it's the #1 tree that they will build a nest in. And bald eagles are also endangered. So the cutting down of white pine is not helping their population either because they have no place to nest now. Young bears actually will use white pine as training to learn how to climb safely from their mother bears. So white pine's like training wheels for baby bears. It's how they learn to climb. It's how they learn to be safe while doing it as well. So it has a lot of important reasons in nature. So then we went into why was it used again? Crates, boxes, interior design, and basic construction. It's a good sturdy wood, and it allowed people to construct around it. You could use different types of logs and materials on the outside and the interior, but the main structure is white pine. It was also used for ship masts. It was the #1 tree to be picked for Royal Navies for their ships. It was strong, it was durable, it would withstand the battles on sea. Prices were moderate. They're still moderate. Most families can afford to have white pine interior, exterior, what have you. It's also easy to work with. So like you can mold it with your hands, you can mold it with tools, which also decreases the amount of labor you need, which decreases the price of the product. So it's affordable. White pine can also withstand various types of soil conditions. It prefers moist and it will do the best in moist soil, but it can also live in dry soil, rocky soil, and bogs. So it has a variety of landscapes that it can thrive in. So knowing that, I then went into my 4 eras. So pre-colonial. This I actually only found a few days ago, and I was super interested in it. It was just interesting. The Pine Tree Riot of 1772. So this was probably the earliest amount of data I could find and collect. The previous study I had talked about with the white oak, swamp white oak, it didn't really talk about pine. A lot of them don't talk about white pine for some reason. I just don't know if they haven't really done studies on it or what the case is, but there's not a lot of research that applied to what I was trying to get at that worked. But this was a really interesting case. So what happened was the King of England was building up his Royal Navy, and his authority was getting stronger and stronger over the colonies in North America. And at the time, the king would send his personal surveyors to the New World and have them mark trees that were, some stories said like 12 feet wide and, 60 feet tall. Like, I don't know if they're exaggerations or the truth. He was specifically asking for these, but they were big trees. And he would mark them, and those were for his Royal Navy. Well, in New Hampshire, this was going on, and a surveyor came to a man's property and marked the tree to be taken for the king. And the property owner was like, I don't like that. I don't want that. Like, that's my tree. It's on my land. It's mine. So this led to all the local residents of this one town in New Hampshire revolting and testing British authority for the long run. So a lot of historians consider that this was what led to like the Boston Tea Party, throwing the tea into the harbor, all these major tests of British authority that we've been taught in schools. Historians believe this was the first. This was what started everything. Which is kind of crazy that one white pine in this one small town started huge acts of revolt and revolution that we still feel today. After this, New Hampshire also was one of the first states to declare independence, even though they still had the king, and the king still thought he had control. New Hampshire developed their own government and assisted Massachusetts and other states in the region on forming their own governments and establishing independence from the monarchy. It's kind of crazy. It's one tree did this much. You also, the white pine tree is considered by indigenous people, especially the Iroquois, to be the great tree of peace, which brought 5 and then 6 tribes together under one united force and one nation, which is incredible. They laid down their weapons, they laid down the animosity between them to become stronger as a people, to be stronger in a region. So the white pine has a huge, huge historical value to a lot of different people. So then we jump into the industrialization. And in the 1880s, there was actually extensive logging that was so bad that when they tried to regenerate white pine, they didn't regenerate at all. Very little of that population was able to grow. And even when they grew, they were not healthy. They were diseased and they were spreading disease to other trees. So in the modern time frame, the growth rate has decreased due to acid rain from the 1950s. So in the 1950s, when they were testing nuclear weapons, chemicals, all these different compounds that affect our atmosphere today, it also affected the growth rate of white pine. And it was so bad, in fact, that the trees we see today are some of the healthiest they've been in the last 60, 70 years because the acid rain, the sulfur dioxide, the carbon monoxide in the air has been so bad that it isn't until right now that it's starting to heal a little bit. Not enough where we're fixed, but just a little bit, which is, it's a good thing to see. But we're still getting there. But they still say white pine is on the decline, and the biggest thing is climate change. So yeah, that's what I've been working on this semester.
Great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that, Delaney,
Thank
and
you.
giving us some historical context for our focal species. So I guess, to move into the future a little bit, we'll shift gears and go to Piper. Piper Warren, she is also an intern with the Canal Forest Project. Like Delaney, she's a junior at SUNY Oswego, and Piper is studying biology. She grew up in northern New York, and she has always had a long-lasting passion for environmental issues and ecology. Through this project, the Canal Forest Restoration Project, Piper hopes to inspire people to protect, restore, and enjoy the beautiful world we live in. Her focus in working with us on the project has been on public outreach and the sustainability aspects of our project. And she'll be sharing some of that next.
Hello, everyone, and happy Arbor Day. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I have been mainly focusing on sustainability as of right now, since Earth Day was just a couple days ago, and now to celebrate Arbor Day. So number one is like the reason we should be repopulating our forests is for a climate aspect. So one of our main goals of this project, besides understanding the history of our forests and restoring populations along with canal regions, is to reduce the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Trees are a major carbon store that consumes large portions of carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere. And so trees and other plants take in this carbon and convert it into plant biomass as cellulose. And remarkably, at the same time, they are able to produce their own food and provide oxygen, which is necessary for most of life on Earth. But at this time, we are currently releasing abnormally high amounts of carbon dioxide through excessive driving, burning fossil fuels, unnatural farming practices, and other daily practices. However, thanks to trees, about 25% of the carbon released by humans is stored by plants, which of course greatly reduces the overall impact of greenhouse gases present in the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the deforestation rates are very high and unsustainable, and that is reducing the amount of carbon that is stored and also releasing extremely high amounts of carbon dioxide. According to National Geographic, between 1990 and 2016, about 500,000 square miles of forest were lost. And not only does it pollute the atmosphere by releasing more carbon, but it affects wildlife, ecosystems, weather patterns, and more. And planting, so for reforestation aspect, planting trees can and will certainly help. It is like our most natural and beneficial defense against rising carbon levels. They are self-growing, they cost very little, they increase biodiversity, they take care of themselves and provide oxygen for the life that requires it. So I think we owe a lot of appreciation to trees and photosynthetic life. As per my research, large producers of oxygen are leafy trees, and one tree produces as much oxygen in one season as 10 people inhale per year. And this equates to about 260 pounds of oxygen per year per mature tree. An important note, however, is reforesting. It is an important piece of the puzzle, but it alone is not the solution to climate change. We must combine reforestation actions with other activities, such as implementing renewable energy and reducing our own carbon emissions in order to protect the fragile ecosystems across the planet. This is just a little diagram showing basic effects of how trees could save the planet. However, like I said, it just can't do it alone. We have to protect and preserve these forests: mangrove forests, peat bogs, rainforests, marshlands, swamps, kelp forests, coral reefs, because these are all a natural way to store carbon. A second area we should focus on is reforestation for habitat perspective. Forests serve as home to a diverse and unique group of native flora and fauna that is native to each of their specific habitats. So in this project, we focused on the native forests surrounding the canal regions of New York State. A diverse set of plants and animals rely on the native trees in our forests for shelter and for food. Some of our native fauna even rely on the water transported through the trees and cycling back into the planet. The dominant forest along the canal region is an oak hickory forest. And these are found kind of along the canal corridor as well as the Finger Lakes region. And many of their inhabitants include rose-crested grosbeak, scarlet tanager, white-tailed deer, the eastern box turtle, northern flying squirrel, and the spotted salamander, and many more. But lots of birds, including owls, wood ducks, and woodpeckers, use white pine and white oak trees for nesting and as a food source. And as well, mammals such as squirrels, chipmunks, and foxes often nest in the trees. And insects as well live within the bark and leaves of these trees, which if an insect population is highly decreased, it will result in a chain of effects of decreasing populations of organisms that rely on them. A third way that we can, other than reforestation, third way that we can help out our planet is by simple daily activities that each of us engage in, and could certainly make a difference by doing. And these include reducing water usage and consumption. And this can be by efficiently using water to wash clothes and dishes, reducing your shower times, turning off the water when brushing your teeth, and if able, making a rain garden can also effectively reduce the need. So it can more efficiently recycle water through the environment. And then creating a composting system is another simple way to significantly reduce the waste we produce. Also bringing back organic materials into the soil. This also enriches the nutrient content of the soil, which serves as a good resource for gardens, which is another way. By purchasing sustainable goods from the store and reducing meat consumption and growing your own garden and eating your own vegetables from the garden are also effective ways to combat environmental issues on a local and personal scale. Joining community efforts that could involve volunteering for tree plantings, volunteering at your local community garden, participating in land conservation activities, lots of places around the area, host events that the more people that show up and voice their opinions, it'll make a difference. Also, reducing your electricity usage by unplugging devices when not in use. Again, if able, switching to renewable energy sources and encouraging your local community to use renewable energy sources will certainly make a difference. Donating to conservation groups, simply recycling, bringing out, reducing your plastic usage and properly disposing of it. I had a few some sustainable goods that you can look for in the store include bamboo-based products, food from local farmers markets, responsibly sourced meats, and beans because they have a high nitrogen storage. And some products that you'd want to avoid at the store are plastic or single-use containers, disposable utensils, single-use coffee cups, plastic bags, and unnecessary food packages such as pre-sliced apples or other fruits, as well as like coffee pods, like K-cups. An example of a food item that you might want to avoid is palm oil. Palm oil highly contributes to the deforestation and endangering of species. It highly destroys their habitats and often results in the death of many species or populations of species. Then simply taking the time to enjoy the outdoors rather than staying inside and doing other activities that may consume more energy, and going outdoors will certainly better your appreciation for it. This is just a slide discussing how your rain garden works if you're interested. And the best way to begin all of this is simply to make a pledge and design a plan to start taking action, because even the smallest things will make a difference. And so that can include one person recycling one plastic bottle, one person buying a reusable bottle instead of continually using plastic bottles, not using plastic bags anymore, all sorts of stuff. Riding your bike one time to the store or to school or to work, recycling the plastics and glass and that is used. And it all adds up, especially if all of us contribute. So thank you and happy Arbor Day.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Piper, for sharing those tips on Arbor Day and in Earth Week of how to be friendly both to our forests, but also the earth in general. I want to just share a little bit about kind of our progress and where our project stands right now. So let me go here. Oops. Okay. So currently with our project, I'm gonna just share a couple images. So right now we have about several hundred oak and pines growing in an enclosure at Rice Creek Field Station. I'll kind of toggle down here. Here's George and Jane kind of standing among some of the older representatives, and they represent white oak, swamp white oak. We also have some bur oak in there too, and white pine. And a lot of these are to the point where we can distribute them. And here's another image of some of our oak trees growing. This past year, we did a lot of seed collecting. George and Jane especially, they and their collaborators did a lot of this. We have about 3,500 seeds prepared, either already in the ground, just waiting to germinate, that haven't germinated quite yet because of the time of year, or basically kind of in like a mimicked winter condition in our fridge, and they're ready to plant. So we should have a good crop of new trees heading our way. So here are some images from our project. Now, unfortunately, because of our current situation with the coronavirus, we may not be able to do as many of the in-person tree distribution events that we've often done in the past. But we are still kind of exploring maybe creative ways where we could still distribute trees to people, even if that's something like people just have to swing by, grab a tree, and keep going so that we don't, come into close contact with anyone. So if you're interested in getting free trees, you please check our website and our social media for updates, because we'll be sharing both in our newsletter and on our website and on social media any updates about ways that people can obtain trees. And in the meantime, we'll just keep on keeping our trees alive and keeping the new generation of trees coming, so that especially as soon as we are able to resume face-to-face interaction with people, we'll be able to restart our public distribution as soon as possible. Some ways to help our project, if you're interested, would be volunteering. We have a number of volunteers, but volunteer labor does so much for our project, especially with the seed collecting phase and even the growing phase. So that is one huge way to help our project. And eventually, when we have face-to-face interaction available again, volunteers who could help represent the project and distribute trees at different places are also welcome. In addition, at the meantime, our project is run almost entirely on donations. And we really want to always be providing free trees to the public. And we find that very important so that anybody could receive a tree and contribute to this effort. So if you want to make a donation to help us buy materials and supplies for the project and make sure that we're able to distribute as many free trees as possible, we have information about how to donate on our webpage. So you can find that and also links to our social media by going to oswego.edu/Rice Creek. That's our main field station webpage. And then if you click the link for the Canal Forest Restoration Project, there's a lot more information there. We'll also kind of add that into the details of this video once we've ended the live session and we're able to add in some more details for folks. So having said that, if anyone has a question for us about our project, there's a live chat feature in YouTube and you can submit any questions you have there. And I will see if any questions have come in.
Can we make comments too?
Absolutely.
I was very impressed with the interns' presentations. They're very good. And I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things. That is, we probably need to at some time also have a webinar more about the very difficult information to get about the indigenous population times, when what were the state of these trees and forests when the Native Americans were here without us from Europe. And we just need more information about that. There are the important stories that Delaney, for instance, mentioned about the Three Rivers area and the sacred white pine and stories and so forth that could be, I think, explained a lot too. And there are other tribes that have the white pine or other trees as their particular sacred tree. And there's just so much that came from that area right around you there too, with the tribal areas and other places. The acorn food, I think, I usually like to try to stimulate people by saying that acorns, I think the archaeologists are beginning to think that acorns might have been a very much more important food for the development of human people for tens of thousands of years because of its high nutrition value, and that it's it's stored well and so forth. And that around the earth that various people have used acorn food way before the grains were developed to any extent. So that human beings probably owe a lot to that particular food. And there's a lot of information about preparation and stuff like that we could probably talk a lot more about. Also, I wanted to emphasize the age of trees, and that trees that live for 400, 500 years are very different than the trees that we see around the canals now. And the turnover of the carbon and stuff in a tree that lives 50 years is very different than a 400-year-old tree. And that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, and George makes a good point because certainly our white oaks, these are even more long-lived than our red oak species in the area that a lot of us more commonly see in the forest. So among our project's trees, white pine and white oaks in general are very long-lived in terms of our northeastern forest trees, well into 400 plus years. So that is significant if we're thinking about trapping carbon. Okay, let's see. We have a question come in. So does us feeding squirrels via home feeders help save the acorns for the trees? I don't know who wants to take that question. I know Delaney was talking about this, but if anyone else wants to pipe in, please feel free.
I want to actually come in here. Just mentioning squirrels eating acorns, and that could harm the trees. But on the other hand, the positive is that's natural. Usually plants produce more seeds than they grow. Only 1% of the seeds which are produced by the plant, if they germinated, that would be enough. So squirrels take those seeds, bury them somewhere, and they forget. And they bury them at the right depth, and they germinate. That is like a noble, positive, actually contribution of squirrels to trees. Some other trees depend completely on birds for the same reason. Some birds also collect the seeds and they bury them for later, and they forget, and they also germinate. So that's not unusual. I think the squirrels eating and actually half of the acorn and left it alone is not gonna affect their mission, which is again bury acorns and seeds, and those germinate and actually compensate for the loss of seeds. Just to make this point actually a little stronger, here at Rice Creek, we have the feeders, and we have the sunflower and so forth. And so the squirrels take those seeds and they bury them in various area around the building. And when spring comes, they germinate in bunches. Sometimes in the grass area, not in the beds area. So they take those seeds, they put them in different places, they bury them, and they forget them, and they do germinate.
Yeah, and one thing I'm thinking about, absolutely agree with what Kamal said here. Having just come off our previous webinar discussing kind of the loss of American chestnut in our area forests. This is me speculating, but one has to wonder if you have a huge ecological turnover like that, like losing a quarter of your species in some forest, or a quarter of your trees in some forest, and massive nut producers like a chestnut, and you have a certain population of animals depending on that food source, be it passenger pigeon or other squirrels, suddenly you lose that species. You could see how then that creates a lot of pressure on remaining trees. And so maybe that's where some of this comes in too. And so with the question, I guess, it's kind of like in general, it seems like, maybe our squirrels now that we're more at like a stasis aren't exactly negatively affecting any trees because they are actively planting them too. But of course, it can't hurt to feed squirrels.
Right.
Well, that was the only question that's come through for us now. I will say that if anyone has questions for our team, you can always reach out to us either on social media or at our project email. That's canalforestrc@gmail.com. And we are, very eager to have, people ask their questions, people collaborate with us, whatever you want to do, please feel free to reach out. Do any members of our project have anything else to add before we wrap up?
I think it would be great help for our viewers to contribute to the project by sending seeds and acorns. Would be great. Seeds of white pine and acorns of white oaks.
Yes, absolutely. So either if you send us your seeds or if you tell us where to find your trees and we can come collect them, that will be a huge help for our project.
Yes.
Yes, some years there are many seeds like acorns, and some years there are very few, or in an area, and it kind of depends on the weather at a certain time of year. And we had almost no white oak acorns in the upstate New York area last fall. And we had to really scramble a lot to find trees that were bearing and, and get acorns. So it varies. So it's really good for people to identify trees, to learn how to identify them and to watch them and know when they're producing and collect them before the animals get all of them. And because they will, the deer and so forth are right there to grab them. And, birds also eat these acorns. I've noticed that birds, particularly jays, they take the acorns and they will carry them quite a long way sometimes and drop them and plant them that way. But they eat them too.
Yeah, so I will say, I guess more specifics if people want to mail us seeds. So keep your eye out for them. And we request that if you're sending us oaks, it's best if they stay moist. So just include some moist paper toweling and an example leaf or twig in with your acorns, and then you can ship them to us at Rice Creek Field Station. The pines are a little more forgiving. So if you collect your white pine cones, tap out the seeds, you can ship those to us just fine too. All right. And if you want to find out more about growing trees from seeds or how to collect them, you can join us for our 3 o'clock webinar, How to Grow Trees from Seeds, that I will be co-hosting with one of our project collaborators, Steve Frost. Any last comments from anybody?
One last thing I forgot to mention is I just want to recommend, Kristen, you showed me this video of Greta Thunberg. I just wanted to recommend it, called Nature Now. I think she says it in a very powerful way. Sustainability. Talks about sustainability and climate change. And so I just wanted to recommend that.
Yeah, on Arbor Day and on Earth Week, that is a great video to watch if you're interested in sustainability aspects of reforestation or forests and protecting forests. It's, yeah, Greta Thunberg's Nature Now video. Yeah. Well, on behalf of the Canal Forest Project team, we want to thank everybody who tuned in. If you have questions, you could always submit a comment. Again, email us. And we want to thank you for your time and interest and wish you a very happy Arbor Day.
Thank you.
Happy Arbor Day.
Happy Arbor Day.